Wild West love stories. Tales of passion, written on the American frontier.
The last light of day bled across the New Mexico horizon, painting the vast, empty plains in hues of blood and rust. Inside a solitary ranch house, silence reigned, thick and suffocating as the dust on the untouched furniture. Jedediah Stone stared at the empty chair across his table, a ghost of a memory flickering in his tired eyes, the stillness of the room a tomb for all the words he no longer spoke. Suddenly, a sharp crack echoed from the world outside, not the familiar sound of thunder, but the raw, violent splintering of wood. His body moved before his mind did, hands reaching for the cold steel of the Winchester rifle leaning against the wall, his movements economical and grim after years of solitude. He peered through the grimy window, and his breath caught. There, cornered against his well by 3 snarling coyotes, their eyes glowing like malevolent embers in the twilight, was a woman. She was a slip of a thing, looking as if a strong gust of wind could carry her away, yet she held nothing but a black, cast-iron pot, swinging it with a desperate, furious strength that defied her frail frame. She didn't scream. She didn't cry for help. She simply fought, a silent, feral battle against the encroaching darkness, her face a mask of grim determination. Her world had been reduced to the space between her and the hungry beasts, a world she refused to surrender. Will this lone woman survive the brutal welcome of the Wild West? And what will the silent rancher, a man who has locked himself away from the world, do when he finds this stranger fighting for her very life on his land? Stay with us to uncover this story of grit and grace. And if you enjoy tales of courage and unlikely love, please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Wild West Love Stories for more. Part 1. Where the Trail Ends. Sevens. Jedediah Stone lowered the rifle, the metal still warm against his calloused hands, and watched as the last of the coyotes vanished into the deepening twilight, its yelp of thwarted hunger swallowed by the immense silence of the plains. He remained a statue by the window, a man carved from the same stubborn rock and unforgiving timber as his home, his eyes narrowed not on the beasts, but on the woman. She hadn't moved. Her back was still pressed against the rough wood of the well, her chest rising and falling in ragged, desperate gulps of air. The cast-iron pot, her only shield, had fallen to the dust beside her, a dark, hollowed-out moon in the dirt. He expected tears, or perhaps a collapse into a heap of exhausted relief, but she did neither. Slowly, deliberately, she pushed herself away from the well, her knees trembling but not buckling. She bent down, retrieved the pot, and cradled it in her arms like a lost child. For a long moment, she just stood there, a lone, defiant silhouette against the bruised purple of the sky. Jedediah had seen many things break in this land: wagons, spirits, promises, bones, but he had rarely seen something so close to shattering refuse to do so. He had lived in his self-imposed tomb for 5 years, watching the world through a pane of glass, letting the dust settle on his heart as it settled on his wife's belongings. He felt nothing, or so he told himself every morning. But watching her, a flicker of something ancient and unwelcome stirred within him, not pity, but a grudging respect. It was the same stubbornness that kept him breathing, the same refusal to lie down and die that had marked him since the fever took Eleonora and the boy. He exhaled a slow breath, the sound loud in the dead air of the house, and made his decision. He did not move to the front door, but to the side, unlatching the heavy oak plank that led to the porch. The hinges groaned in protest, a sound of disuse. He stepped out into the chill air, his boots making no sound on the packed earth, the Winchester held loosely at his side, not as a threat, but as an extension of his own guarded nature. She heard him, or perhaps sensed him, her head snapping up, her eyes wide and feral in the gloom. He stopped a dozen paces from her, leaving the space between them as a proving ground. He could see her more clearly now. The sunken cheeks caked with dust and grime, the lips cracked and bleeding, the dress that was little more than a collection of rags hanging off a frame as thin as a fence rail. But her eyes, they held the fire of the sunset. They were not the eyes of a beggar. They were the eyes of a survivor who was simply out of road. For what felt like an eternity, the only sound was the low moan of the wind whispering through the dry grass. He gave her nothing, no softening of his expression, no word of comfort. He simply waited, testing her resolve. Finally, her voice came, a dry, cracked whisper that the wind almost stole before it could reach him. "I don't talk much, mister," she said, her gaze unwavering, "but I can cook." The words hung in the air, not a plea, but a statement of value, the last coin she had to offer in a world that had taken everything else. Jedediah's eyes dropped to the cast-iron pot she clutched so fiercely, its handle worn smooth, its surface blackened by 100 desperate fires. It was a tool, but it was also an anchor. He understood anchors. He looked past her, down the empty trail where she had come from, seeing nothing but encroaching night. No wagon, no horse, no family. She was utterly, terrifyingly alone. His gaze returned to her face. Name? The word was a piece of gravel in his throat. "Abigail," she breathed. "Abigail Kane." He gave a single, curt nod, the smallest possible motion of acceptance. Then he turned and walked toward the house, not looking back to see if she would follow. He heard the hesitant scuff of her worn-out boots in the dirt behind him, a sound that seemed to break a spell that had held the ranch for half a decade. He led her not into the main living space, but through the back, into the heart of the house, the kitchen. And it was a heart that had stopped beating long ago. Abigail stopped just over the threshold, her exhaustion momentarily forgotten as she took in the scene. A thick coat of gray dust lay over every surface, a shroud preserving a moment of sudden abandonment. Cobwebs, intricate and ancient, hung from the ceiling beams like macabre chandeliers. A row of iron pans on the wall were veiled in rust, their handles drooping like the heads of withered flowers. The great hearth, built of river stone, was swept clean, but it was a cold, barren mouth, its last embers having died so long ago that even their memory had turned to ash. The air was frigid, carrying a scent not of food or fire, but of time itself, stale, still, and sorrowful. This was a place where life had not just paused, it had been renounced. Jedediah saw her take it all in, saw the flicker of understanding in her weary eyes. He moved past her, his footsteps echoing in the oppressive quiet, and pushed open another door at the far end of the kitchen. "You can stay here," he said, the words feeling foreign on his tongue. He nodded toward the room without meeting her gaze. The room was just as coated in dust, but it was different. It was a shrine. A four-poster bed stood in the corner, a beautiful hand-stitched quilt pulled taut across it, its vibrant colors muted by the gray film. On a small nightstand sat a porcelain basin and pitcher, and beside it, a wooden hairbrush with a few long, dark strands still caught in its bristles. A faded lace doily, yellowed with age, lay atop a dresser, and on the wall hung a small, cracked mirror. It was a room that was still waiting for its occupant to return. Abigail stepped inside, her bare feet making no sound on the smooth floorboards. The air carried the faintest, most stubborn trace of lavender. She knew, with a certainty that went bone deep, whose room this was. This was hers, she said, her voice softer than a whisper. It wasn't a question. Jedediah stood in the doorway, his large frame filling the space, his face an unreadable mask of shadows. For the first time, his eyes met hers, and in their depths, she saw a flicker of a pain so profound it was almost terrifying. He gave the slightest of nods. "Eleonora," he said, the name a shard of glass. "Fever took her. 5 years back." He offered no more, no story of his son, no details of the loss. That single word, that name, was explanation enough for the cold kitchen and the haunted silence. Abby lowered her eyes, an ache in her chest that had nothing to do with her own suffering. "I will keep it clean," she promised softly. "I promise." He stood there for another long breath, as if wrestling with the ghosts he had just summoned. Then he turned without another word. His boots thudded heavily back through the kitchen, the sound of the main door closing echoing like a final judgment. Abigail Kane was left alone in the room where a ghost still lived, the heavy cast-iron pot still clutched in her arms. She walked to the window and looked out at the black, star-dusted expanse. The trail she had walked had ended here, at a place as broken and haunted as she was. For the first time in weeks, a roof stood over her head, and for the first time in years, she wasn't sure if that was a blessing or a curse. She was too tired to decide. Carefully, as if not to disturb the sleeping memories, she placed her precious pot on the floor beside the bed, laid her worn shawl on a chair, and sank onto the edge of the mattress, not daring to lie down, not yet. She was hired. She was sheltered. But she was not home. Not yet. Part 2. The Thawing of Stone. Sevens. Abigail awoke to a cold that was absolute, a deep, cellular chill that had nothing to do with the pre-dawn air and everything to do with the silence of a house that had forgotten how to live. She had slept fitfully on the edge of Eleonora's bed, too afraid of disrespecting the dead to pull back the covers. For a moment, lying there in the gray gloom, the familiar tendrils of despair began to curl around her. It would be so easy to stay here, to let the dust reclaim her as it had everything else. But then she remembered the defiant swing of her pot, the feral glare of the coyote, and the grudging respect in Jedediah Stone's eyes. She had not survived this long only to surrender to a ghost-filled room. With a resolve that was more instinct than courage, she rose. Her first act was not for herself, but for the house. She returned to the kitchen, the cold heart of the home, and declared a silent war on the decay. She found a bucket, a stiff bristled brush, and a bar of lye soap that was hard as a rock. For hours, she worked with a methodical fury. She scrubbed the grime from the countertops until the pale, scarred grain of the wood showed through like a long-held secret being revealed. She scraped rust from the iron pans, her knuckles raw and bleeding, until they hung on their hooks not as relics, but as tools waiting for a purpose. She swept the thick blankets of cobwebs from the ceiling, dislodging years of trapped stillness. The work was grueling, but with every layer of filth she removed, she felt as though she were scrubbing away a layer of her own painful past. The true test, however, was the hearth. It was more than just a place for fire. It was the soul of a kitchen. She cleared the old, cold ash, her hands turning black with the remnants of long-dead fires. She found a small stack of kindling Jedediah had left by the back door, a silent offering, and laid the fire with the same care her father had once taught her. When she finally struck the match, the tiny flame trembled for a moment before catching, and as the first real fire in 5 years crackled to life, the room seemed to exhale a breath it had been holding for an eternity. The light danced across the newly cleaned surfaces, and for the first time, the kitchen felt less like a tomb and more like a promise. That night, she cooked. It was nothing grand, just a simple stew made from dried beans she found in the pantry and a few wild onions she dug up near the well. But as the savory aroma began to fill the house, pushing back against the scent of dust and sorrow, it was a miracle. When Jedediah came in from the fields, he stopped dead in the doorway, his usual impassive expression momentarily broken by something akin to shock. He didn't speak, merely stared at the bubbling pot, the warm, firelit room, and at her. She served him a bowl, and they ate in their customary silence, but it was a different kind of quiet. It was no longer the empty silence of absence, but the full, warm silence of a shared meal. The next morning, Abigail found the kindling box by the hearth was not only full but stacked with a meticulous precision the previous pile had lacked. A few days later, as she struggled to roll out biscuit dough on a small, warped sideboard, she felt his eyes on her. He said nothing, but the following afternoon, she heard a rhythmic, scraping sound coming from the main dining room, a part of the house she hadn't dared to enter. Peering in, she saw him, sleeves rolled up to his powerful forearms, planing the surface of the long, magnificent oak table that had been unusable for years. He worked with a singular focus, his movements patient and sure, smoothing away the warps and scars left by time and neglect. It was the work of a man not just fixing a piece of furniture, but restoring a piece of his own life. That evening, he simply nodded toward the newly restored table. "You need space to roll dough," was all he said. It was more than she had expected. That small victory gave her courage. A week into her stay, with the kitchen now humming with a rhythm of its own, she felt a pull toward Eleonora's room. It was no longer just a place to sleep, but a mystery she felt compelled to understand. She cleaned it with a gentler hand than the kitchen, treating each object with a reverence for the woman who had loved them. Polishing the dresser, her fingers brushed against a loose floorboard beneath it. Curiosity overriding her caution, she pried it up. Beneath it lay not treasure, but something far more precious. A heavy, cedar-lined chest. It wasn't locked. With trembling hands, she lifted the lid. The scent of dried lavender and old paper filled the air. Inside, nestled in linen, were 3 leather-bound journals. She lifted one out. The cover was worn smooth, and opening it, she saw page after page of the most elegant, precise handwriting she had ever seen. There were detailed drawings of plants, flowers, and herbs, with notes on their properties, their uses for healing teas, poultices, and tinctures. Pressed between the pages were actual specimens, preserved with loving care. A vibrant blue cornflower, a delicate sprig of chamomile, a crimson leaf of a wild berry. This was Eleonora's legacy. She was not just a rancher's wife, she was a healer, a student of the land. Abigail felt an overwhelming connection to this woman, a kinship that transcended death. She was about to close the journal when she heard the sound of an approaching horse. Her heart leaped into her throat. Jedediah was in the south pasture. Visitors were not something she had prepared for. She quickly replaced the journal, secured the chest, and hurried to the kitchen, trying to compose herself. A moment later, a tall man with a silver star pinned to his vest stood at the open kitchen door. He was broad-shouldered, with a weathered face and eyes that saw everything. "Jedediah!" he called out, his voice a commanding baritone. When he saw Abby, his expression shifted from friendly to cautious. "Well now," he said, removing his hat. "Didn't know Jed had company." Jedediah appeared from around the side of the house, his face unreadable. "Brody," he acknowledged with a curt nod. "Sheriff Brody," the man corrected, his eyes still fixed on Abby. "Just making my rounds. Haven't seen you in town for a while, Jed. Wanted to make sure the silence out here hadn't finally swallowed you whole." His tone was light, but his gaze was sharp. "Who's this?" "She works here," Jedediah stated flatly, stepping slightly to the side, a subtle but clear gesture that placed him between the sheriff and Abigail. "Name's Abigail Kane." Sheriff Brody sized her up, taking in her clean but worn dress, her flour-dusted hands, and the wary look in her eyes. "Kane, you say? Haven't heard that name around these parts. Where you from?" "East," Abigail said, her voice barely a whisper. "Just passing through, were you?" Brody pressed. "I'm staying," she said, finding a sliver of courage. "I cook." The sheriff's eyes flickered with a new light, a professional suspicion. He turned back to Jedediah. "You know anything about her, Jed? Folks don't just appear out of the dust for no reason." "I know she's a good cook," Jedediah said, his voice low and final. "And she works for me. That's all you need to know." The tension was thick enough to cut with a knife. Sheriff Brody held Jedediah's gaze for a long moment, then slowly put his hat back on. "All right, Jed. You know your own business. But you know I worry. A man alone this long. Things can get complicated." He tipped his hat to Abigail, a gesture that held no warmth. "Ma'am." With that, he mounted his horse and rode off, leaving a cloud of dust and a new, unsettling silence in his wake. The fragile peace had been broken. The outside world, with its laws and its suspicions, had found them. Part 3. Echoes and Omens. Sevens. The fragile peace that had settled over the ranch was as delicate as a spider's thread, and in the days following Sheriff Brody's visit, Abigail felt it tremble with every gust of wind. Jedediah had retreated further into himself, the brief thaw in his demeanor freezing over once more. He was not unkind, but the silence that now stretched between them was heavier, laced with an unspoken tension she couldn't name. To escape it, she found herself drawn back to Eleonora's room, to the cedar chest and its treasure of journals. The books became her sanctuary and her only companion. She would sit for hours in the low rocking chair by the window, tracing the elegant script with her finger, feeling the presence of the woman who had penned the words. Eleonora came alive in those pages. She was a woman of quiet strength and profound observation, who saw the harsh landscape not as an enemy, but as a garden of secrets. Abby learned the names of the local flora: the silver-leafed sage that could soothe a fever, the stubborn purple thistle whose roots could be ground into a pain-dulling paste, the rare, pale desert marigold that Eleonora had coaxed to grow in a small, protected patch behind the house. One entry, in particular, made Abby's breath catch in her throat. Eleonora wrote of her firstborn, a son named Thomas, and a terrible cough that had seized him in his second winter. With the doctor days away and a blizzard raging, she had used her knowledge to brew a potent tea from pine needles and wild licorice root, staying awake for 3 nights, forcing the warm liquid past his blue lips until the fever broke. "The land provides," Eleonora had written, her handwriting shaky with exhaustion and relief. "But only if you know how to listen." A deep, aching respect bloomed in Abby's chest. This was not just a collection of recipes, it was a testament to a mother's fierce, unwavering love. One afternoon, lost in the world of the journals, she didn't hear Jedediah enter the house. He came upon her in the rocking chair, one of Eleonora's books open on her lap, a faint, sad smile on her face as she read. The sight struck him with the force of a physical blow. For a dizzying second, the afternoon sun slanting through the window caught the dust motes and the line of Abby's jaw in just such a way that it wasn't her he saw, but Eleonora. He saw his wife, her dark hair pinned up, humming softly to herself as she rocked their son to sleep in that very chair. The memory was so vivid, so brutally clear, that the air was driven from his lungs. The ghost he had kept locked away for 5 years had suddenly taken on flesh and blood, and the agony was unbearable. "What are you doing?" His voice was not loud, but it was as sharp and cold as splintered ice. Abby jumped, the journal sliding from her lap. She saw the look on his face, a raw, haunted anguish, and she understood. I'm sorry," she stammered, scrambling to pick up the book. "I found them. I didn't mean any harm." "That is my wife's room," he bit out, each word a stone. "Those were her things." He didn't have to say more. The accusation was clear. "You are a trespasser here, a pretender in a dead woman's chair." He turned on his heel and strode out of the house, slamming the door behind him with a crack that echoed the breaking of their fragile truce. Abby was left alone, the journal clutched to her chest, the warmth of her discovery turned to ash in her mouth. She had not been healing a home, she had been desecrating a tomb. The echo of the past had become a wall between them once more. While this quiet drama unfolded at the ranch, a far more dangerous performance was beginning 20 miles away in the dusty town of Redemption. A man rode in on a tired-looking bay horse, dismounting in front of the saloon. He was tall and lean, with a disarmingly handsome face and eyes the color of washed-out denim. He moved with an easy confidence, but anyone watching closely would see the subtle tremor in his hands, the faint sheen of sweat on his brow. This was Caleb Thorne, and he was a master of his craft. He didn't storm in demanding information. He entered the saloon quietly, took a seat at the far end of the bar, and ordered a whiskey. For a full hour, he said nothing, nursing his drink, his gaze fixed on the murky liquid as if it held the answers to all his troubles. The bartender, a burly man named Gus with a handlebar mustache, eventually gave in to curiosity. "Long road, friend?" Gus asked, wiping the bar with a dirty rag. Caleb looked up, his eyes filled with a carefully crafted weariness. "The longest," he said, his voice raspy with emotion. He let out a long sigh. "Don't suppose you've seen a woman pass through here? My wife." He pulled a small, silver locket from his pocket. "Her name is Abigail." He opened it to reveal a tiny, painted portrait of a pretty, smiling woman who bore a passing resemblance to the real Abigail. "She's not well," he continued, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper that drew in not only Gus, but two other patrons nearby. There was a tragedy. We lost our first child this spring. The fever. It broke something inside her. She gets confused, thinks people are after her. Last week, she just vanished. Took nothing but her mother's old cooking pot. His voice cracked on the last words, a perfect, heart-wrenching performance of a man on the brink of despair. I've been tracking her for weeks. I'm just so afraid for her, out here all alone. She wouldn't hurt a fly, but she's so scared. All I want is to bring my Abby home. The story was a masterpiece of manipulation, tailored for maximum sympathy. He was not an aggressor, but a savior. Abigail was not a survivor, but a victim of a broken mind. The cooking pot was not a tool of defiance, but a symptom of her insanity. By the time he finished his second whiskey, the entire saloon was on his side. Gus was giving him the drink on the house, and the other men were patting his shoulder, offering words of support. The story, too good to keep quiet, spread from the saloon like a contagion. It was told at the general store, where the women clucked their tongues in sympathy. It was repeated at the blacksmith's forge, where the men shook their heads at the tragedy of it all. By sundown, the tale of the handsome, heartbroken husband searching for his poor, lost wife was the only topic of conversation in Redemption. It was an omen, a dark cloud gathering on the horizon, unseen by the two people at its center. The final destination for the rumor was the sheriff's office. Brody was finishing his paperwork when Martha, the postmistress and town's foremost gossip, bustled in, her face alight with righteous concern. "Sheriff, you must do something," she began, and proceeded to recount the entire tragic story she'd heard from the blacksmith's wife, with a few extra embellishments of her own. Brody listened, his expression impassive, but his mind was racing. Abigail Kane, the haunted-looking woman from the east. The woman, Jedediah, a man who hadn't let anyone near him in 5 years, was now sheltering. It had never sat right with him. Caleb Thorne's story, tragic as it was, made a terrible kind of sense. It explained her fear, her silence, her sudden appearance out of nowhere. A husband looking for his wife was a matter of law. A grieving man protecting a troubled woman was a matter of civic duty. His loyalty to Jed warred with the cold, hard logic of the situation. But the story was too detailed, too plausible, and Caleb's public grief too convincing. The scale of justice in his mind began to tip. He looked at Martha, his face hardening into the mask of the law. "Thank you, Martha. I'll look into it." The words were calm, but inside him, a decision had been made. The time for quiet observation was over. He had to go back out to the Stone Ranch. He had a duty to perform. Part 4. The Price of Sanctuary. Sevens. The heavy silence that Jedediah's anger had left in its wake lasted for 2 full days. It was a suffocating presence, thicker than dust, colder than the nights that were now drawing in with the coming of autumn. Abigail worked mechanically, her hands performing the familiar rituals of kneading dough and stirring pots, but her mind was a whirlwind of fear and regret. She had overstepped, had trespassed on a grief so sacred that her very presence had become a profanation. She expected him to tell her to leave at any moment, to cast her back out into the wilderness from which she'd come. Jedediah, for his part, was lost in a storm of his own. The vision of Abby in Eleonora's chair had torn open a wound he had thought long scarred over, and the pain was as fresh and raw as it had been on the day he buried his wife and son. He avoided the house as much as possible, working himself to the point of exhaustion in the fields, hoping the physical ache would drown out the one in his soul. They were two ghosts haunting the same space, separated by a wall of unspoken sorrow. It was late afternoon on the third day when the sound of hoofbeats broke the spell. It was a single rider, approaching not at a canter, but at the deliberate, measured pace of a man on official business. It was Sheriff Brody. He dismounted not at the barn, as a friend would, but at the front porch, as the law would. Jedediah met him there, his face grim, while Abby watched from the shadows of the kitchen doorway, her heart a cold stone in her chest. "Jedediah," Brody began, his voice devoid of its usual warmth. "I'm not here for coffee. I'm here about the woman." He looked past Jed to where Abby stood. "Ma'am, I need to ask you some questions." Abby felt her blood run cold. She stepped forward, wiping her damp hands on her apron, forcing herself to meet the sheriff's scrutinizing gaze. "Her husband is in town, Mrs. Thorne," Brody said, his use of the name a deliberate blow. "He's been looking for you for a long time. He's very worried." The world tilted beneath Abby's feet. Thorne. The name he had threatened to brand her with. The lie was so audacious, so complete, that for a moment she couldn't breathe. My name is Kane," she managed, her voice trembling. "I am not married." Brody's expression hardened with a sort of weary pity. "He told me you might say that. He said the loss of your child. It did something to your memory. He has a locket, ma'am, with your picture in it." Every word was a nail in her coffin, a carefully constructed lie that painted her truth as madness. "That's not true," she cried, her voice rising with panic. "He's a liar. He's a monster." Her outburst was exactly what Brody had expected from a disturbed woman. He sighed, turning his attention to Jedediah, who had been watching the entire exchange with a terrifying stillness. "Jed, you see how it is. The man has a plausible story. He's willing to forgive. He just wants to take her home, get her the help she needs. The law is on his side here. You can't keep another man's wife on your property." This was the moment. The price of sanctuary was being called due. Abby looked at Jedediah, her eyes pleading, certain that this was the end. He would hand her over. It was the logical, sensible thing to do. He owed her nothing. She was just the cook. But Jedediah didn't look at Brody. He looked at her. He saw the raw, genuine terror in her eyes, a terror that no liar could fake. He saw the defiance that had faced down coyotes. He weighed that against the memory of a smooth-talking stranger in town. He had spent 5 years trusting nothing but the silence and the hard truths of the land. The land did not lie. And in his gut, he knew this woman wasn't lying either. He took a slow step, placing himself firmly between Abigail and the sheriff. "Her name is Abigail Kane," he said, his voice a low rumble, each word chosen with deliberate weight. "She is not Mrs. Thorne. She is my cook." Brody's face flushed with frustration. "Jed, for God's sake, be reasonable. You've known her for what, a few weeks? I've known you for 20 years, and I'm telling you, you're making a mistake." "And in those 20 years," Jedediah countered, his voice dropping even lower, dangerously calm, "have you ever known me to be a fool? Or to abide a liar?" The question hung in the air, an indictment of their entire friendship. "She is under my protection, Brody," So, unless you have a warrant signed by a judge, you will get on your horse and you will leave my property." The finality in his tone was absolute. It was a declaration of war. Brody stared at him, disbelief warring with anger. He saw that he could push no further without drawing the pistol at his hip, and he was not willing to cross that line with his old friend. He shook his head, a look of profound disappointment on his face. "You're wrong, Jed," he said quietly. "And you'll regret this." He turned, mounted his horse, and rode away, not looking back. The friendship of 2 decades had just been sacrificed for a woman he barely knew. When the dust from Brody's horse had settled, Abby finally let out a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding. "Thank you," she whispered, her body shaking with the aftermath of the confrontation. Jedediah merely grunted, turning to walk toward the barn, the wall between them seemingly as high as ever. But his action had spoken louder than any words of comfort could. He believed her. The consequences of his choice became clear 3 days later when he rode into Redemption for supplies. The town that had once greeted him with quiet nods of respect now met him with open hostility. At the general store, Mr. Henderson, who had known him since he was a boy, served him with curt, clipped words, his eyes refusing to meet Jed's. Outside, women pulled their children closer as he passed, whispering behind their hands. He was no longer the tragic recluse. He was the fool, the outcast, the man harboring a crazy woman and defying the law. He bought his flour and salt, endured the silent judgment, and rode home, the sting of exile a bitter taste in his mouth. He returned to the ranch to find Abby on the porch, waiting, her face etched with worry. She had seen the way he carried himself, the rigid set of his shoulders. She knew what had happened. He dismounted, and for the first time, instead of retreating to the barn, he walked over and sat on the porch steps, a few feet from her. "They believe him," he said. It wasn't an accusation, just a statement of fact. "Yes," she said softly. "His stories are easier to believe than my truth." He looked at her then, his gaze direct and searching. "Who is he, Abigail?" "The real story." And so she told him. Not everything, not the litany of abuses and fear that had chased her across the territory. But she told him of Caleb Thorne in the boarding house, of his possessive eyes and his cloying words, of the way he made her skin crawl, of his cruelty when she refused him. She told him how she fled in the night, certain he was a man who didn't let things go. Jedediah listened without interruption, his hands resting on his knees, his knuckles white. When she was finished, the sun was setting, casting long, sorrowful shadows across the yard. The wall of grief and misunderstanding between them had crumbled, replaced by the harsh reality of a shared enemy. He was no longer just her employer, and she was no longer just his cook. They were allies. A garrison of 2 against the world. He stood up, his tall frame blocking out the last of the light. "Let them talk," he said, his voice filled with a grim resolve. "This is your home now. No one is taking you from it." It was not a declaration of love, but it was a vow of sanctuary. And in that moment, under the weight of the town's scorn, that was more than enough. Juak thoi. Jai la luk moi thu bung no. Part pient se la quok joy jau quoi kung. Noi long dung kam juok thu thach van hung. Bimat juok foi be duoi an hoang hon. Moi sukien chung ta jang shai dung se hoi tu tai jai. Toi se jam bao truong joan naik sung jang la jin jiem kua kau chuyen. Part 5. A reckoning at dusk. Sevens. The vow of sanctuary. Jedediah had made was tested sooner than either of them could have imagined. Their newfound alliance had forged a quiet intimacy between them, a world contained within the weathered fences of the ranch. But outside those fences, Caleb Thorne was growing impatient. His plan to use the law had been thwarted by the unyielding will of a man he had underestimated. Public sympathy was useless if it couldn't deliver him his prize. His charm curdled into a cold, venomous rage. If he couldn't have Abigail by cunning, he would take her by chaos. He decided that if the ranch was her sanctuary, he would burn it to the ground, metaphorically and perhaps literally. His attack was not a frontal assault, but the insidious work of a coward. It began at the well. Under the cloak of a moonless night, he crept onto the property and emptied a burlap sack filled with unslaked lime and other poisons into the deep, cold water that was the lifeblood of the ranch. The effect was not immediate. It was 2 days later that Jedediah noticed one of the 2 cows was listless, refusing to drink, its eyes glassy and dull. That afternoon, Abigail drew a bucket of water for the kitchen and noticed a faint, acrid bitterness to it, a taste of sickness that clung to the back of the throat. She said nothing, but a knot of dread tightened in her stomach. Jedediah, his senses attuned to the subtle rhythms of his land, knew something was fundamentally wrong. He walked to the well, the silence of the plains seeming to press in on him. He lowered a bucket, drew it up, and didn't even need to taste it. The smell, faint but foul, was enough. He scanned the ground around the well, and his eyes caught on the faint scuff marks of boots that were not his own, and a few pale, chalky granules of lime clinging to the damp earth. A cold, killing fury, an emotion he hadn't felt in 5 years, settled over him. This was not just an attack on him, it was an attack on his home, an attempt to poison the very heart of the life he and Abigail were so fragilely trying to build. He knew Caleb was out there, watching, waiting for them to grow weak, sick, or desperate enough to flee. He strode back to the house, his face a mask of stone. "He's poisoned the well," he told Abigail, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. "Pack a few jars with clean water from the rain barrel. Don't light the main lamp tonight. Bar the door behind me. Do not open it for any reason until I return." Her eyes were wide with terror. "Where are you going?" "I'm going to fix a fence," he said, and the lie was so thin it was transparent. "He's been watching. It's time to give him something to look at." He took his rifle, checked the action, and walked out of the house without another word. The sun was beginning its slow descent, bleeding fiery orange and purple across the horizon. The light was treacherous, casting long, distorted shadows that seemed to writhe and twist like living things. Jedediah rode out toward the western fence line, his movements calm and deliberate, the very picture of a rancher finishing his daily chores. But every nerve in his body was screaming, his eyes scanning every rock, every clump of sagebrush. He was the bait, and he knew the predator was near. He dismounted by a loose fence post and began the charade of mending it, his rifle leaning against the post within arm's reach. The minutes stretched into an eternity. Then, a voice, dripping with smug satisfaction, emerged from the shadows behind him. "Evening, Stone. Water tasting a little off today?" Caleb Thorne stepped out from behind a rocky outcrop, a cruel smile on his handsome face. He held a pistol, and it was aimed squarely at Jedediah's chest. "I have to admit," Caleb continued, circling him slowly, "you're more stubborn than I expected." All this trouble for a half-wild cook who doesn't even have the decency to be grateful. Jedediah didn't turn around, his hands still on the fence post. "She owes you nothing." "Oh, she owes me everything," Caleb sneered. "She thinks she can just run away. No one runs from me. Now, here's what's going to happen. You're going to walk away from your rifle, and we're going to go back to the house. I'll take what's mine, and if you're lucky, I'll leave you here to watch the buzzards circle." At that moment, Jedediah moved. He didn't reach for his rifle. He kicked the fence post with all his strength. The half-rotten wood snapped, and the entire section of fencing collapsed with a loud crack, startling Caleb for a fraction of a second. It was all the time Jed needed. He launched himself at Caleb, a roar of pure rage tearing from his throat. The two men crashed to the ground in a brutal, desperate tangle of limbs. Jedediah had the strength, but Caleb had the cunning of a cornered snake. He fought dirty, gouging at Jed's eyes, kicking at his knees. Jed landed a solid blow to Caleb's jaw, and Caleb's head snapped back, but as they rolled, Caleb's hand darted to his boot and came out holding a long, wicked-looking knife. Before Jed could react, Caleb thrust upward. A searing, white-hot pain exploded in Jedediah's side. He gasped, his strength faltering, and Caleb used the moment to shove him off, scrambling to his feet. Jed lay on the ground, clutching his bleeding side, the world beginning to swim in and out of focus. Back at the house, Abigail was a prisoner of fear. She had watched Jed ride out, and every minute that passed was an agony. But as the dusk deepened, a primal instinct overrode her terror. She couldn't just wait. She crept up to the attic, peering out of the small, grimy window that overlooked the western pasture. She saw it all. The confrontation, the sudden, violent fight, and the horrifying glint of the knife. She saw Jed fall. A scream died in her throat, choked off by a surge of pure, unadulterated fury. She was done running. She was done being afraid. She stormed down the stairs, her eyes landing on the one thing that had been her shield and her anchor since she'd left everything behind. The heavy, black cast-iron pot sitting by the cold hearth. She grabbed it, unbarred the door, and ran out into the dying light, her bare feet flying over the rough ground. Caleb stood over the wounded Jedediah, laughing, savoring his victory. "Looks like your sanctuary has failed you, old man," he gloated, raising his pistol to finish the job. It was then that a wild cry split the air. He turned, confused, to see Abigail charging toward him like a vengeful spirit, the heavy iron pot held high. She was 100 feet away, too far to be a real threat, but the sheer, unexpected ferocity of her attack was enough to make him pause. At that exact moment, another sound cut through the twilight. The thunder of a galloping horse and a voice that boomed across the plains. "Thorn! Drop the weapon!" Sheriff Brody crested the nearby ridge, his revolver drawn, his face set like granite. After his confrontation with Jed, doubt had gnawed at him. He had sent a telegraph to the marshal's office in Kansas, asking about a man named Caleb Thorn. The reply had arrived that afternoon. Thorn wasn't a grieving husband. He was a wanted conman and swindler with a history of preying on vulnerable women. The realization of his mistake had sent Brody galloping toward the ranch, praying he wasn't too late. The convergence was chaos. Caleb, caught between the charging woman and the armed sheriff, panicked. He fired a wild shot in Brody's direction, then turned to run. But in that moment of distraction, Jedediah, using the last of his strength, lunged forward and tackled Caleb's legs, sending him sprawling. Abigail, still running, didn't stop. With a final, desperate sob of effort, she swung the heavy iron pot with all her might, bringing it down on Caleb's head with a sickening thud. He went limp and lay still. The sudden silence was deafening, broken only by the sound of Abby's ragged breaths and the pounding of Brody's horse as he reined in beside them. Jedediah lay on the ground, his blood staining the thirsty earth, a dark crimson in the twilight. The reckoning was over. Part 6. What the Dawn Brings. Sevens. The aftermath of the violence was a silence more profound than any that had come before. Sheriff Brody, his face a mask of grim duty and personal shame, hoisted the unconscious Caleb Thorne over his horse and tied his hands, his movements efficient and devoid of any satisfaction. "I'll see he hangs," he said to Abigail, the words a poor substitute for an apology. "I was wrong, ma'am, about everything." But Abby barely heard him. Her entire world had narrowed to the man bleeding out on the ground, his life seeping into the thirsty New Mexico dirt. Jedediah was groaning, his eyes fluttering, a testament to his stubborn refusal to surrender to the darkness. With Brody's help, she managed to get him back to the house, a grueling, agonizing journey of 100 yards that felt like 100 miles. They laid him on the long oak table in the dining room, the same table he had so carefully sanded for her, now transformed into a makeshift operating table. Brody lingered for a moment, offering to fetch a doctor, but they both knew a doctor was a day's ride away, a journey Jedediah did not have the time for. "Go," she told him, her voice surprisingly steady. "Do what you must. I will handle this." The sheriff looked at the slip of a woman, her face streaked with dirt and tears, but her eyes burning with a fierce, unwavering light, and for the first time, he saw not a victim or a suspect, but a force of nature. He nodded and left her to her work. The moment the door closed, Abigail's terror threatened to overwhelm her. But then her gaze fell upon the kitchen, upon the hearth she had brought back to life, and she remembered the elegant, steady handwriting in Eleonora's journals. "The land provides," Eleonora had written, "but only if you know how to listen." Now, with the life of Eleonora's husband in her hands, Abigail began to listen with all her soul. She flew into action, her fear channeled into a focused, desperate energy. She tore strips from the cleanest sheets she could find for bandages. She boiled water in her cast-iron pot to sterilize them. Then, she ran to Eleonora's room, to the cedar chest, and pulled out the journals, her hands frantically flipping through the pages she had come to know by heart. The knife wound was deep, still weeping blood. She remembered a drawing of a feathery-leafed plant, yarrow, which Eleonora had called staunch weed for its ability to clot blood. Abby had seen it growing in a stubborn patch by the barn. With a lantern in hand, she raced outside into the dark, her fingers searching for the telltale leaves. She found it, crushed the leaves and flowers into a paste as the journal instructed, and applied the poultice directly to the wound. The bleeding, miraculously, began to slow. But the greater danger was the fever that she knew would come. She searched the journals again, finding a section on a tea made from willow bark to combat pain and fever, and another from the silver-leafed sage she had seen Jed brush past 100 times. For the rest of that long, terrible night, she was a whirlwind of motion. She brewed the teas, forcing the bitter liquids past his clenched teeth. She bathed his face with cool water, her whispers the only sound in the house as she pleaded with him to hold on. She was no longer just Abigail Kane, the runaway cook. She was a healer, a guardian, a woman fighting a war against death itself, using the wisdom of the ghost who had once owned this house as her only weapon. For 3 days, Jedediah hovered in the gray twilight between life and death. He was lost in a fever dream, muttering names she didn't know, his body slick with sweat. Abigail never left his side. She slept in a chair by the table, waking every hour to check on him, to change his bandages, to give him more of the healing teas. The ranch was forgotten. The world outside ceased to exist. Her entire universe was the breathing of this broken man. On the 4th day, Sheriff Brody returned. He found her asleep in the chair, her face pale and drawn with exhaustion, her hand resting on Jed's forearm. He didn't wake her. He quietly left a large crate of supplies on the porch: flour, smoked bacon, coffee, and a bottle of proper whiskey. Tucked inside was a letter from the mayor's wife, expressing the town's deep regret and offering any help they might need. Redemption was atoning for its judgment. Later that afternoon, Abby was changing the poultice on Jed's wound when his eyes flickered open. They were no longer cloudy with fever, but clear, and they were looking directly at her. He tried to speak, but his voice was a dry rasp. She quickly brought a cup of water to his lips. He drank, then looked at her again, truly seeing her for the first time since the fight. He saw the dark circles under her eyes, the raw skin on her hands, the fierce, protective set of her jaw. His own hand, calloused and weak, slowly lifted and covered hers. "Abby," he whispered. The single word was filled with a universe of gratitude, of awe, of a truth that no longer needed to be hidden. The fever was broken. His, and the one that had held the house in its grip for 5 long years. A week later, Jedediah was on his feet, weak and sore, but alive. The wound was healing cleanly, a testament to her tireless care. The silence between them had returned, but it was a new kind of silence, as comfortable and profound as the vast, starry sky above. It was a silence of complete understanding, where words were no longer necessary. That evening, as the sun set, casting a warm, golden glow over the plains, he found her on the porch, watching the colors change. He held something in his closed fist. "I went into her room today," he began, his voice quiet and steady. "For the first time in years, I didn't feel like I was in a tomb. It just felt like a room." He sat beside her on the top step. She was a healer, Abby. Eleonora. She loved making things grow, making things whole again. I think she would have liked you." He opened his hand. Resting in his palm was a simple, modest silver ring, worn thin with age. It was Eleonora's wedding ring. Abby's breath hitched. "Jed," she started, but he gently silenced her. "This is not to replace what I lost," he said, his eyes meeting hers, clear and full of a quiet, powerful emotion. "Nothing can ever do that. But you didn't replace her. You honored her. You used her knowledge to save my life. You brought this house back from the dead. You healed me." He took her hand, his touch gentle. "A home shouldn't be a monument to the past, Abby. It should be a place where a future can grow. This ring, it doesn't belong to a ghost anymore. I want it to belong to the future. Our future. If you'll have it." Tears streamed silently down Abby's face, tears not of sorrow or fear, but of a joy so overwhelming it felt like sunlight blooming in her chest. She had arrived with nothing but a cooking pot and a history of pain, a woman who didn't talk much. And here, at the end of the trail, was a man who didn't need words to hear everything she had to say. She couldn't speak. She simply nodded, a slow, deliberate gesture of acceptance. He slipped the ring onto her finger. It was a perfect fit. As the first star of evening pricked the velvet dark, he leaned in and kissed her, a kiss that was not about passion, but about promise. It was a kiss that tasted of wood smoke, healing herbs, and a love as sure and quiet as the dawn that was sure to follow. The light in the kitchen window glowed warm and bright, a beacon in the vast, wild dark, a signal that two lost souls had finally, truly, found their way home. In the end, the story of Abigail Kane and Jedediah Stone was not a tale of grand passions declared under a starry sky, nor was it written in flowery letters or whispered promises. It was a testament to the quiet, stubborn power of kindness, a love story told in the language of freshly baked bread, of a carefully stacked woodpile, and of a healing poultice applied by a steady, gentle hand. It teaches us that a home is not a place you find, but something you build, beam by beam, from the sturdy timber of trust and the solid foundation of shared vulnerability. It reminds us that a heart, no matter how long it has been walled off by grief, can learn to beat again when warmed by the simple, profound heat of another's care. Abigail, the woman who arrived with nothing but a cooking pot, taught Jedediah how to live again. And Jedediah, the man who had forgotten the sound of laughter in his own home, showed her that safety wasn't a place on a map, but the steadfast presence of a person who chooses to stand by your side. Their love, etched in the grain of a restored oak table and sealed with a simple silver ring, proves that sometimes the most powerful vows are the ones never spoken aloud. They are lived, day by day, in the sacred, courageous act of staying. Thank you for joining us on this journey through the heart of the West. If the story of Abby and Jed's quiet courage and hard-won love resonated with you, please show your support by giving this video a like, sharing it with someone who appreciates a timeless romance, and subscribing to Wild West Love Stories for more tales of devotion forged in dust and fire. What was your favorite moment in their story? Share your thoughts in the comments below. We read every one,